Hola, ¿cómo estás? Espero que estés súper bien. This is Tamara Marie, host of the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast. Now, before we jump into this episode, I wanted to let you know about a special opportunity that you're definitely going to want to take advantage of, especially if your goal is to become fluent in Spanish. For a limited time only, my team is opening the doors to listeners of the podcast to take advantage of a free language coaching session. Now, in this session, it's not just we're teaching you about verbs or grammar, but we're really going to do a deep dive into what are your goals for learning Spanish, assess where you are on your journey to fluency at the moment, and help you map out a 90-day plan for how you can get to fluency. So we are going to help you take your Spanish to the next level, whether you're afraid of speaking Spanish or you just get a little bit nervous when you're talking to native speakers, or maybe you've got some of the basics down, but you really know that you struggle with getting your Spanish to flow and your listening skills aren't up to par. Whatever it is, even if it is a specific grammar issue, we will help you map out how to tackle that. And normally these sessions do cost, so we are offering a few slots for free. There are limited spaces available and they'll only be open up through the end of the month. So make sure you sign up. Go to SpanishConSalsa.com/coach. That's SpanishConSalsa.com/coach to book your free language coaching session where we will help you map out a 90-day plan to get to Spanish fluency. Okay, let's get started with the episode.
Bienvenidos! Welcome to the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast, the show for Spanish learners that love music, travel, and culture. Close your grammar textbooks, shut down the language apps, and open your ears to how Spanish is spoken in the real world. Let us show you how to go from beginner to bilingual. Here is your host, certified language coach, Tamara Mari.
Hola y bienvenidos al episodio 59. Welcome to episode 59 of the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast. In this episode of the podcast, I am interviewing Mari Salvestrini, and she is a polyglot who speaks several different languages. She is originally from Venezuela, and she currently lives in the Netherlands. She's a language coach, and she shares content on her YouTube channel every week about how to learn a language effectively, how to create the right habits, and also how to enjoy the process while you learn. We cover so many different things in this conversation, but because Mari is from Venezuela, I've asked her to share with us not only some tips about language learning, but also some characteristics of Venezuelan Spanish. So as you know, I really am interested in different cultures and dialects, and I like to expose you all on this podcast to conversations that will give you some more insight into Latino culture and not just the language itself. So we will be talking a little bit about Venezuela and some uniquely Venezuelan words that you will only hear in the country. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Mari. Let's get started. Thank you, Mari, for taking the time to join me on the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I know we've been trying to get this together and coordinate for a little bit, so I really appreciate your time. And I always like to have different people to just kind of share their language learning experience, because for some of my listeners who are thinking about, becoming fluent in Spanish, they're trying and they're not really there yet. It can be inspiring to hear from someone like you who's already learned different languages, and we'll talk about that in a second. So I really do appreciate you taking the time to come on. So if you could just kind of tell us a little bit about you and how you got started with language learning.
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Mari. I am originally from Venezuela, but at the moment I'm living in the Netherlands. I started learning languages. Actually, it wasn't my choice. My mom sent me into a bilingual school, and that's how I started. I also have Italian family, so I was interested in many different cultures because I was exposed to it. And then as an adult, I decided to keep learning languages, and that's when I learned Dutch, Portuguese, and further Italian.
Okay, so you have a family that's from Italy as well?
Yes, my grandfather was from Italy, so we have some of the traditions on my father's side.
Okay, and I heard you say that it wasn't your choice to go to the bilingual school, so it's something that your parents sort of enforced. And I know some of the friends I have that are in the US and maybe they're trying to raise their children to be bilingual, that sometimes children can be resistant to the idea. They want to speak the community language. They don't want to be seen as odd or different. So did you struggle with that growing up? Were you open to the idea at the beginning, or was learning languages something that you sort of slowly had to grow to love over time?
So when I started with English, I was only 2 years old, so I was not very conscious. But my mom always tells me that I didn't like it because I couldn't understand. But I was learning. So then when I was around 5 years old, my mom took me to Disneyland, to Walt Disney World in Florida. And I heard English being talked. And, in order to talk to all the characters, like the Little Mermaid and everything, I had to speak English. So I think that's when I started realizing what a language was. And that's when I started being interested in languages, because I saw that it was useful. So I always tell parents, like, if you show your kid why they're learning the other language and you give them a valid reason, they will be motivated.
Yeah, that was kind of genius on your mom's part to involve the Disney characters, right? So you'd be naturally motivated. It wasn't like she's trying to force you to learn grammar. She's just like, do you want to talk to the Little Mermaid or whatever?
Yes.
She speaks English.
She also bought me a Backstreet Boys album, and I started learning the lyrics. So it was just hilarious, the whole experience. But it really helped me to understand why it was important to learn more languages.
And so you mentioned the Backstreet Boys. So did music play a role in your language learning at all, or was it just sort of that one song that you were trying to learn, or did you continue to use music as you learned other languages as well?
Oh, I've always been super interested in music. I've always been a musical person, so it's always been a role. I cannot learn a language without music. That's the first thing I do when I start learning a language. I search for the music. If I don't like the music, it's way harder for me to learn. I'm super motivated by music.
Wow, yeah, and it is funny too, because that's been part of my experience, and really how I got into learning Spanish was through salsa music, and just kind of wanting to know what were people saying, and being involved in the dance community as well is something that really just pushed me naturally to learn, because I wanted to know. So and when I started learning Portuguese, I did something similar because I love samba, and I was really trying to learn the dance, which was hopeless for me. I can't dance samba at all.
It's really difficult.
It is. My hips do not do what they are supposed to do with samba, but I still love the music. And there's a song Magaleña I really like. So when I went to Brazil, that was another thing that really kind of drove me as well, as like really getting into some music from Portuguese as well. So very cool. Yeah, I always like to ask that, because I've had several people on the podcast and they all mention music in some way. And I feel like it's almost like the best kept secret of language learners, because is that something people talk about a lot? They take it for granted. Like, oh yeah, I listen to music because it's like breathing, but it really can help you when you're trying to learn a language, especially with some of the sounds and some of the subject matter that might be particular to that culture.
Yes, and it has many aspects, like the culture, but also the grammar, because musics are like poems, so they have like grammatical tenses that you will not normally hear when you're speaking, and that you have to learn as well. So I think it's very interesting, music overall, to learn languages, and it's fun. That's the most important. It's so much fun.
Do you have any other tips for someone? How many languages do you speak again? You mentioned Dutch, Italian. Obviously, you speak Spanish, English,
Portuguese, and a little bit of German.
German. Okay. So for someone who might be listening to you going, oh my God, I'm just trying to learn one language, right? Like I'm just trying to learn Spanish. What are some of the tips that you would give that you feel have worked for you, no matter what language that you've picked up? What are some of those principles that you've noticed that have been consistent throughout your acquiring different languages?
So I figured that I'm only successful when I focus on the day-to-day and not the big end goal, because it's not, fluency is not like something that you can see or something that's tangible. It's not something that you know either when you have it. So I'd rather not focus on that, but just focus on enjoying every single time I'm exposed to the language, and just be consistent. So it's just a matter of like enjoying every day and being consistent every day.
Yeah, and I think, finding what what you can do consistently, I think is also important.
Yes.
Because people are always looking for that next hack or like the shortcut, or, well, what do you do? Tell me what you do. And which is great. I mean, you want to learn from people who've done it before, but I think most of us, do better when we experiment on our own and we find out what works for us. And if it's something that you can do consistently, you'll make much more progress, even if it's not the perfect strategy. So
Yes, so it takes a lot of trial and error to figure out what it is that works for you. I tried it absolutely all, and my focus right now, and it's been for at least a year, is just focus on creating like language learning habits. So what I will do is that I will make sure that every morning as I wake up, I read in a foreign language, or every time that I cook, I listen to music in foreign languages, and that like little exposure throughout the day helps me progress. And then I also try to speak as much as I can. I speak on my own in my house. I will explain how I'm cooking. I will talk to myself out loud, and that somehow will help in confidence and in just like pronunciation as well.
yeah, I always say, like, if you haven't practiced on your own first, it can be really intimidating when you get in front of a native speaker of that language and you try to start talking for the first time. So practicing on your own, I think, is really helpful. And one thing I do, you're mentioning like habits, and I was thinking about something that I started to do with Spanish, which helped me in my vocabulary too. It's like anytime I go to the store and I had to write a list, I would always do it in Spanish. So I would learn like what all my favorite foods were, were called, because I would do things like that, which is, takes maybe 5 minutes. But, like you said, it's like having those habits so that you have exposure to the language on a day-to-day basis. So
yeah, exactly. Planning your day as well in your target language. It takes a little longer, but at the end you reinforce vocabulary that you will use because it's vocabulary about your life.
Right. And I think people discount that. Like I know I was in a forum earlier, as a Facebook forum on language learning, and someone was asking a question like, well, I'm going to have this language exchange coming up, and I don't know what to talk about. What are some topics that I could talk about? And someone responded like, well, talk about the weather. And they were like, but the weather's boring, and it's like, so the response is kind of back and forth. But she says, yeah, but the weather can be a springboard to so many other conversations. Like, do you like the summer? Do you like the spring? Do you think it's too cold? Like, that can kind of start getting you going in a conversation. But most people kind of discount very, very basic things because it sounds boring. But it's actually very useful, because most of our conversations aren't, very deep philosophical conversations. Yes. There's so many day-to-day things that we have to learn in another language that we take for granted that we can do in our native language. So I think it is a good idea to kind of get some of those day-to-day things down that we might, again, we'll discredit, but those things are very important when you're trying to express yourself and talk to people.
Yeah, and if you have a plan or a dream to go one day to the country where the language is spoken, that's the things you're going to talk about. You're not going to meet a stranger and be like, talk about politics right away. Like, it's not the case, or talk about any deep subject. You're going to talk about most likely the weather.
Right.
And what you ate and, what you visit. So I think that's very important vocabulary to have. And like you said, it becomes something else later. So.
Exactly. And so we're going to switch gears, since you talked about visiting different countries to learn language. Now, I personally love to travel, but I do know that to become fluent in a language, you don't have to go to that place and live there necessarily. There's a lot you can do before you even travel to prepare yourself, whether you're thinking about, just taking a trip or relocating one day to a foreign country. There's so much work that you can do before you get there. And one thing I always tell people is that, especially with Spanish, because I think, and you can attest to this, Mari, that people think Spanish is Spanish, and they kind of go, oh, it's sort of, Spanish is the same, unlike other languages that have these variations. Spanish is just Spanish wherever you go. But I found that not to be the case, right? For me, especially because the music I like is from the Caribbean, right? Like, so listening to someone from Cuba, Puerto Rico is very different than someone from Spain or from Mexico. So, I always tell people to focus on a country of origin, right? Like, I always tell people, like, pick a type of Spanish you want to learn. Even if you want to pretend that you're a native speaker of Spanish, where would you want to be from, right? So I always go through, like, what are the differences between different dialects of Spanish, because I think that they're interesting and I think that can also be helpful. So since you're from Venezuela, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what's different about the Spanish from your country, and sort of what are some of the differences, not only in like the accent, but also some of the words that you might hear in Venezuela that you don't hear anywhere else.
It's very interesting, the differences. First of all, I constantly struggle speaking with other native speakers, like from Spain or other countries, because most of the times they don't understand me. And Venezuelan Spanish is very curious because it is in the Caribbean. So we, more to the north, we have a lot of Caribbean dialects and Caribbean like intonation. But like if you go to the south, it's completely something else. It's more like Colombian or more like even Portuguese. So and with the immigration, we had tremendous amounts of immigration from Europe and Arabic countries, and also the Caribbean. So we have like a mix of languages within our own. So it's very interesting, and I think it's actually very helpful to learn Venezuelan Spanish right now, because like there are so many Venezuelans living the country and they're moving everywhere. So it's more likely that you will find a Venezuelan in your city, if it's a big city at the moment, especially in the United States. If you go to Miami, it's like, I don't know, like 20% Venezuelans at the moment. So yeah, so one of the phrases that normally gets misunderstood is pedir la cola, which is like ask for a lift, but cola also means like butt for other people. So every time we say something like me puedes dar la cola, like can you give me a lift, people are so confused, like what does that even mean? Like we don't know each other that well, what do you try to say, right? So I think it's very interesting to see something that for us is so innocent, for others can sound like really like weird or almost like dirty. And it's just like, we just want to lift. So it's very funny when you realize those things. We have also some words that come from English, because we used to have a lot of like some immigration from the United States because of the petroleum. I don't know if that's the name. Yeah. And one of those, we will used to have like all of these like instruction manuals and all of that in English. So there is this one that I found very interesting, that is echarle pichón, which is actually pichón comes from push on, and it means like keep going forward or like moving forward. Like echarle pichón is like really work towards something bigger. And what else do we have here? Echar sin palo is one of, it's like every man in Venezuela will say this. It means also like, go for a drinks, but it literally means like throw a stick. So that's also very confusing for other Spanish speakers, because it's like, they have no idea what that could mean.
Yeah, where does that come from? Like, what is the correlation of like throwing a stick?
Because un palo was the name of the currency that they will give workers in Venezuela.
Oh, okay.
So you'll throw one of the currency that's like expending it. That's what a beer costs. So that's
okay. Wow, it's interesting.
Yeah. And one of my favorites, it's it's a little long, but it's like llegar a freír tequeños. So tequeños is a type of food. It's like a cheese covering dough, and when we say that is when someone comes super early. So you come too early to the party that you came to prepare this type of food, and this one's very common actually. I say it a lot, like, oh, llegaste a freír tequeños, you came too early to the party. And as you know, Latinos, we're not normally or socially the most on-time people, so it will be very common for a foreigner to come early, and they will hear this phrase for sure.
Yeah, that's funny, because I think I keep wondering like what culture is on time, because I feel like every culture I learn about, not just Spanish speaking culture, but Black culture in the US, or like when I've traveled, I've heard it from like I have some coworkers also from India, and they have like this like similar kind of thing about Indian time, and then there's Black time, and there's this time, there's Latino time. I'm like, well, who are these people who are on time? Everybody has a thing about being late. It's kind of funny.
that I think it comes from where I am now, like the Netherlands, Germany, and Belgium. These people are on time. I always have to be like 2 hours. Like I always come super early because these people like are right at the minute.
Oh, okay.
So I think this.
So was that culture
here.
shock for you when you were you moved?
Yes, a little bit, because for work or for school, I'm normally early. Like we have that sense in Venezuela of like, if you go to work, you have to be on time. Like we're very responsible like that. But when it comes to social events, if like 7 means 9, it's like,
right.
It's not important. It's just like a hanging out. So I have to realize that here, when people say at 6, it means 6, and then they are planning to end at 7. So it's not like, oh, we'll see how it goes.
So, any other expressions from Venezuela?
Yeah, actually, I have one that I love to always explain to foreigners, and it's something that you say when someone's it's being like really annoying and going over the same topic over and over again, and it's "vas a seguir, Abigail." And it comes from a telenovela that was on for so long, like years. And that's not normal for telenovelas. So it was like, oh my gosh, vas a seguir, Abigail? Like, are you gonna keep going with this, Abigail? That's the name of the show. So it's very funny, and it's something that, for example, my grandma will always say to me. So I think it's hilarious.
Well, I have a personal one for me, because I always like to know this word wherever I go, because it's my favorite fruit. So how would you say passion fruit in Venezuela?
Oh, it's actually parchita.
Parchita, okay.
Yeah, so it's like parcha, but smaller. Parchita. Yes.
I have to keep track of this. I have a running list of places to go and how to order passion fruit.
Yeah, another word that changes a lot is a straw.
Oh, yes. Straw is very different. Someone just asked me that the other day, and I could only think of how it was called in Puerto Rico, because that's where I learned it.
I know some places call them like pajilla. Mexico is popote. For us is pitillo.
Pitillo. Okay.
Yes, but pitillo means drugs in other countries, so you shouldn't use it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So
I figured it out the wrong way. So that's why I learned straw is one that changes a lot. Also, popcorn changes a lot.
Okay, yeah, in Puerto Rico, it's like sorbeto, so it sounds like really not at all like any of those other ones.
Yeah, yeah, sounds very different.
That's interesting. Yeah, like it's definitely, and that's why I always say, like, you've got to be really intentional, with language, like
yes.
Because you can end up in a lot of situations like unintentionally where you're saying something that you're like, but I know this is right, but when you're a learner, you might not be aware, because you just ask someone from Venezuela how to call it, and they don't know, because maybe they've only lived in Venezuela, right? So then you go somewhere else and you use the word, and you're like, oh. So you mentioned you found out the hard way that's not the word for straw other places. How did you find out? I know there's a story behind that.
Yes. I was in Mexico with my family, and my mom was with us, and we were kids. We were like 10 or 11. It was with my cousins and my brother. And she asked to the person at the restaurant if he could give us pitillos, a straw. And the guy was confused, because it's this woman, like lovely, chubby, cute woman with like 5 kids. And she's like, yeah, it's for the kids. And the man was very, very confused. And he told my mom and us, like, we do not do this in here. Kids are not allowed to have those.
Oh,
and my mom
God.
was more confused now, because she's like, what are you talking about? So somehow we figured it out, and then my mom was so embarrassed we never went back in there, and it was the closest restaurant to the hotel too, so it was like a pity. But
oh my gosh, that's so funny. Yeah, and that's the thing, I think that you don't realize it until you have those moments, but then you never forget it, right? You never forget.
Yeah. exactly And I can imagine that as a Spanish learner it's very confusing, so I actually agree on that, what you said, just stick with the country and just try to go with it.
And speaking of Venezuela, so I'm curious, because we haven't talked about this in a while. I know we talked a while ago, we met, there was a lot in the news about Venezuela, right? There's all the political upheaval and the president and all of this. So can you give us like a quick update? Like, how are things now? Because I know you still have family there. So what's the situation in Venezuela? Because it's not really been in the news lately.
Yeah, so the situation is more or less the same. It's very difficult to live. It's very expensive right now. For example, everything is, a lot of people use the dollar. If you're in a good position, you can use the dollar, which is actually not legal, but everyone uses it. So for example, like a can of Coke will cost you maybe $5, which is a lot. Like,
wow,
it's more than in the countries where the dollar is used, or it's more than the euro even. So it's very expensive to get by with some things. Other things are still cheap, and some other things you can still find, but it's just overall hard. Plus, it's not safe. It's not really a safe place to be. So you cannot really go out with your phone in your hand. You have to always be overly aware. And like my family always tells me, like, they don't go out at night anymore. So if it's after 6 p.m. when it's dark, people don't go out as much. So it's a very difficult. For me, it's kind of normal because I grew up with it and I saw it gradually go down. Yeah. So it's kind of normal. And I also try to not read so much about the news because it's really hard when it's your own country. So, like if I hear about Iran and other countries, for me, it's like it's terrible, but I don't feel it the way I feel it with my country. So it's very difficult. I think it's very difficult to be there, but it's also very difficult to leave. So there's not like a right answer of what to do over there.
It is really difficult to sort of, keep up with the news and really what's going on. But I think it's, unfortunately, it's another one of those cultural things that people don't realize, that a lot of Latin America, the way that, unfortunately, sometimes the way politics happen is just not the same as it is in the U.S. Yeah. And right now, everyone's, there's very politically divided time in the U.S. as well, and we have all of our sort of debates about it, but it's not the same, right? It's not the same.
No, it's not the same because it even if in the U.S. it's not politically ideally right now, everything still functions and everything in most places I believe. I haven't lived in the U.S., but I believe that you can still have like a lot of opportunity and a lot of like a lot of opportunity and a lot of like growth. Yeah,
the lights don't go out here because people don't like the president, right?
Exactly.
That's the thing people don't realize. Is that still an issue? Is there still like issue with the power and everything in Venezuela?
It's always been an issue ever since I can remember. Ever since I can remember, it's been this government. So for me, it's ever since I can remember. And yeah, it's always the power, the water, and the internet too. They fail sometimes. Also because there's no maintenance and there is not more investment into the equipment. So even if if the whole world right now will have 5G, we wouldn't get it. At least not in the same quality because there's not the infrastructure to provide it. So it's very old, everything that it's regarding technology in Venezuela.
Yeah, it's also, I know when I went visit Dominican Republic, it's also a thing where, the lights would just go out and people, it's just normal. And I made a mistake. I remember this, one of my embarrassing stories. So I was asking, ¿por qué se fue la luz? Right? Like, what, because I knew that the lights went out there. So I was really just trying to make conversation. So when I asked why the lights went out, they thought I was saying they didn't pay their bill, like the light bill.
Oh.
Say like, no, we paid. It just happened. I'm like, oh no, I wasn't trying to be insulting. I was trying to because I knew about it. I was trying to oh yeah, I can make conversation because I know this. And they took it as like me trying to say they didn't pay the light bill. And I was like, oh, that didn't go well.
Yeah. And it also happens sometimes where there are a lot of political rise-ups and situations where just to piss people off, they will take the lights off. So quite something. Wow. It's a loaded question to ask also.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, where do I start, honey? It's a lot.
Right. Yeah, so don't ask that question if you're ready.
No, it's too complicated.
I learned the hard way, that one, right? It's like, oh, okay, se fue la luz. But at least you know what it means. It's, se fue la luz. The lights went out.
Yeah. People will scream a lot of stuff when...
Yeah. Definitely. Well, I don't want to end on a bad note then with that. I want to talk about some of the good things about being from Venezuela, or some of the things that make you proud to be from where you are, even despite, some of the issues the country's been having lately.
Yeah, so for me, it's Venezuela. It was a country that was had a lot of immigrant influence. We were welcoming where the rest of the world was during a war. It was like the paradise to go, where it was endless summer, and I'm very proud of that, because it says a lot about my ancestors, and it says a lot about how little trouble we had with different races and different perspectives and different cultures. So I think that's amazing. And also Venezuelans are very have like an entrepreneur soul, so you will find in places where there are a lot of Venezuelans, like Madrid or Miami, you'll find a lot of stores that are owned by young Venezuelans, because for us it's like the normal thing to do, to be an entrepreneur and to really go further than we can.
Very cool. And so you mentioned the Caribbean part, and it's funny because I usually don't think of Venezuela when I think of the Caribbean, but there are some islands, right, in the northern part of the country?
Yes, there are all the northern coast, and we have, I think it's over 20 islands that are in the Caribbean. They're small, and there are a few bigger islands like Isla Tortuga, Margarita. So I, for example, will spend all of my Christmas in an island, and I have family that is from the Caribbean side. It's very cool, I think, because they have like a little bit more, I don't know how to call it, like sazon, like a little bit more,
more
flavor.
Yes.
It's actually if you step in some places like in Aruba, you can see Venezuela. It's very close.
So maybe for those of you out there who are thinking, oh, I don't want to go to Venezuela because of all the trouble there now, maybe, the Caribbean coast and checking out some of the islands there that are near Aruba would be a good way to experience the country without some of the, security concerns.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Mari, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join me and to talk to us on the podcast. If folks want to get in touch with you, where can they find you on social media?
Yeah, so you can find me on YouTube as Mari Polyglot. That's Mari Polyglot. And then you can find me also on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. I post every week on YouTube, and then every day on my social media on how to learn languages effectively. And I also share my own journey learning all the languages that I've learned and that I'm learning at the moment.
Yeah, and it's amazing because if you follow Mari on Instagram, you will know all the different ways she really does make language learning a part of her routine. I've been watching some of your stuff with Japanese and different languages, and so she's got some really great tips out there. So if you're looking for a little inspiration or some great ideas of ways to incorporate language learning into your daily schedule, definitely follow her on Instagram and check out her YouTube as well. A lot of very useful information.
Thank you so much for having me.
I hope that conversation with Mari Salvestrini has really inspired you to keep going as you are learning Spanish. And also, if you heard some of her stories, that making mistakes is a part of language learning. And I say that so much now that it's becoming cliche, but even a native Spanish speaker from Venezuela going to a different country has had some embarrassing moments with the language. So don't ever feel bad about getting something wrong, because that's how you learn, that's how we grow. Next week, we will be continuing with another interesting conversation, and we'll be talking about why it is that you may not necessarily have to relocate or even travel to become fluent in Spanish. So a lot of us think that if we hop on a plane or if we're just dropped off in a foreign country, that's the best case scenario for full immersion for us to become fluent. And while it can be an immersive experience, there's also a great argument for why this might actually not be the ideal way to learn a language to fluency. Okay, so we'll be talking about that next week. So as always, I hope that something you heard on the podcast will take you one step closer from being beginner to bilingual. Hasta la próxima.
Thank you for listening to the Learn Spanish con Salsa podcast at learnspanishconsalsa.com.